Okay, today we're going to talk about POPI and GDPR, the data privacy laws. So POPI and PAIA are the South African laws regarding privacy and access to information. POPI details information that is considered private and how you must protect this data when you're dealing with it. PAIA is the Promotion of Access to Information Act and details what you need to put together such that people can ask your company for the personal data they may have regarding your individual. You're expected to check the compliance of all your service providers and whether they comply to POPI. So if you have other people that do work for external parties but may be working with that data, you have to check their compliance. And there's a special category of information called account information which has stricter punishments. Those punishments can go up to 10 million rand fines and 10-year jail sentences. In most cases, consent is required for people to use your personal data, which obviously is becoming contentious with all of these calls we're getting from a million different places trying to sell you stuff, because did you consent to them using that data? So those kind of things are what you need to look for and make sure that you've got consent to work with the data in the fashion that you are. GDPR is the European law to protect data privacy. It applies to any company dealing with Europe or their citizens, so it often applies to companies in South Africa as well. It has very strict fines. They're typically like 4% of the company's turnover, and that can be quite material to your company if you get fined by it. It has started a movement in most of the rest of the world, and California especially has put in some very strict rules around it, but the USA is following and a lot of other countries are following suit, and GDPR has almost become the standard. POPI is very similar to GDR, and the standards inside the two are comparable. So complying to POPI means you've complied to most of GDPR and vice versa. So personal data in your job. You may deal with personal data in your day-to-day responsibilities, especially if you are HR, payroll, these kind of places. Any admin kind of department would have lots of personal data that it's dealing with. You need to ensure that this data is stored, transmitted, and processed securely. So it means that if you're sending it anywhere, you need to make sure that the mechanism you're using is secure, that you've password protected the files, that you've encrypted the files where possible. And in most cases, that would mean that you need to be wary of using simple systems like email, file transfer systems that aren't secure. Those sort of things would not be acceptable. You need to minimize the data you collect and work with, so never gather anything that you don't need. It just exposes you to higher risk. You're expected to delete the data when you no longer require it. And that's a tricky one, because we're in the habit of just collecting all data, mainly because data is valuable, storage is cheap, so we collect tons of stuff. And the laws all prescribe the fact that any data that you no longer require should be deleted. Now, when you need to share this data with other parties, you need to make sure that they comply to the same standards that you're applying. Otherwise, you are the person that's going to be penalized for it. It is your responsibility to check that the third parties comply to the same standards. And when you're sharing data with these parties, share only the data that they require for the job that they're going to do, so that you're not exposing yourself to greater risks. And anywhere in this process where you have had a data loss, you have to report it to the regulatory authorities, to the POPI regulators in the country, and from then investigation will ensue, and you may be fined, and there may be other issues around there. The other mechanism that works is where individuals will lodge a complaint with the regulator and they will investigate you. So if the regulator comes knocking on your door, it's typically because they've had complaints about your use of personal data. So what is personal data? Well, that's anything that's unique to a person outside of their business context. Home address, your cell phone number, your personal email address, your ID number, any of these kind of things are considered personal data. Anything that can identify you personally, individually. And you have that also in a business context where you may have a work telephone number, but that's fine because you actually publish that, put that on your business card, and it's considered public data. But something like your employee number is only on your payslip, so that shouldn't be distributed easily and those sort of things. In that's an identifiable number that relates just to you. And say, for example, your HR department had a process where they verify you are who you are by saying what's your address and what is your employee number, and then I will, change the details on your payslip, for example. That's where the risks come in of losing all of this data. So anything that's individual to the person, even from a business context, should be protected, should be considered sensitive, and that's a good acid test. If you think that you could use this information to identify a person or verify a person's identity, it's definitely personal data. The other category of personal data is account information. It's a very loose description, so it could mean your Xbox account for your games and your tokens. Those carry a heavier penalty, and because they carry a heavier penalty, we have to be very careful what we're doing with them. Now, places like HR and Para will have everybody's bank account number. Extremely sensitive data to work with, extremely sensitive from a fines perspective as well. So when you're working in the company and you're dealing with personal data, please apply all of these thoughts. The way the regulator operates is what they call the reasonable person test. So is this, the way that you operated with that data, is it considered reasonable? Is it considered responsible? And if anywhere in those actions you didn't show that any other person would have dealt with the data in the same way, any responsible person would have done the same thing, then you fail the test and you're liable for the fines. So please take care with what you're doing and follow the guidelines. Thank you.